and welcome to Historia Canadiana. My name is Patrick, and this is a podcast about Canadian culture, usually literature, and the way it interprets and informs this nation's history. Before we get started, I want to send out to my listeners, relatively few as they may be, my support in these tough times. We're all in this together. I know this is confusing for anyone, and that we're all affected in wild and unexpected ways. Hang in there, everyone. We're going to get through this. Today, I'm going to cover the early French language literature outside of the exploration texts. If you want to know more about that type of writing, check out episode number 4 that we did here on Samuel de Champlain. This means that today we're going to cover early prose, verse, and general writings from the early 17th century up to around the 1800s. I can allow myself to cover this much time because New France produced little literature outside of exploration, anthropology, and history, so I can cover quite a range in a short amount of time. Now, astute listeners will also have noticed that I go slightly beyond the time frame of New France's existence into the early stages of British domination in Canada. I chose to do this because there are already some interesting shifts that occur in the literature so early on that can inform the relations that French and English speakers would have for the coming centuries in Canada. I'm actually doing this show despite having gone past this time period in other episodes, in recent episodes, because I felt that I hadn't done New France justice as an entity that did have a significant impact on Canadian history. I talked about it briefly in episode number 2 and 4 through exploration and through their relations with natives, but very little outside of that. I want to rectify this now and build a more complete version of what that place was like and what came out of it, and certainly what lasted to this very day outside of simply French speakers in Canada. I want to begin with a brief reminder of what New France was like and unpack why there was so little writing outside of exploratory or historical texts, or ones that recounted the daily life in the region. New France was officially recognized as an entity starting in 1534 with the arrival of the Breton Jacques Cartier onto the banks of the St. Lawrence River, and his claiming of the land in the name of the King of France. But the name actually first appeared on a 1529 map written and created by an Italian named Girolamo de Verrazzano. I'm butchering that, I don't care. Who was on a French-endorsed mission to find the fabled passage to the east. This version of New France, on a completely inaccurate map, was located just north of the Outer Banks of North Carolina, which Verrazzano believed to be the Pacific Ocean. There was no understanding that North America was so large back then, so I guess he gets a pass for making that mistake. Anyway, fun little tidbits aside, the version of New France that we commonly know of today began with Cartier's claim of the land and ended with the British conquest in 1763. I don't want to retread too much on this part because of what I've stated before in previous episodes. As a quick recap, at its peak, New France covered from modern-day Quebec through what was then known as Louisiana, which was essentially Middle America west of the Mississippi River. It is a massive territory where very few people lived. By the middle of the 18th century, that whole territory housed around 55,000 settlers. This is where we will start discussing some newer material, because this will have an impact on the production of literature in the area. Despite France being one of the most populated areas in Europe, few people actually left the country in order to head to this new colony. There were obviously multiple factors for this, the most important being the simple fact that life would have been excruciatingly difficult in the colony. There was warfare with native populations and the English. There was little to no development out of what you could do for yourself. And the environment was much more brutal than what people were used to in France. Surprisingly, they don't have as much snow and cold as we do in the winter here. I know I'm blowing some people's minds with that fact, but I swear it's the truth. The point is, if you weren't a soldier, a missionary, or an explorer that was sent to the colony by the French higher-ups in order to pacify, chart, or convert the region, there was really no valid reason to go to New France. You could, of course, go there to start a new life, but it was relatively minimal, the amount of people that did that compared to the other occupations that I just mentioned. It was a kind of vicious cycle. Because few people went or were sent there, fewer people wanted to go. There were some attempts by the French government to boost the population through the example of the famous Filles du Roi into the colony, which was essentially a wave of women that were meant to balance out the mostly male and homogeneous population of Canada. But that didn't work out as well as expected, and nevertheless the population kept going up just barely. There was also an issue with who was allowed to enter the colony. Ironically, for a nation that wanted to catch up to the fast-growing British colonies in America, France would limit who could go to New France and represent the French in North America. They wanted to create a unified and quote-unquote truly French state here. That means that groups like the Protestants, which were called the Huguenots in France, were barred from going across the Atlantic to the New World, thus continuing the established tradition in France at the time of persecuting those who were not Catholic, or the right kind of Christian. Hence, we find ourselves in a world that is mostly inhabited by soldiers and missionaries, whose poetic abilities were not necessarily what they wanted to hone first if they wanted to survive in North America. But there were, of course, some exceptions, and this is where we will make our first literary pit stop, with Marc Lescarbot. Marc Lescarbot is relevant to an early history of New France, as he would have been a contemporary of Samuel de Champlain, and joined forces with the man at times as an explorer and settlement establisher. But his place in history is actually remembered more from a literary perspective, not just in Quebec or in Canada, but possibly in all of North America. Initially, Lescarbot was a lawyer who came to the settlement of Port Royal in what was known as Acadia in 1606, around the age of 36. From there, he would have traveled around the St. Lawrence River Valley, during which time he would write and record his findings on the land, like many of his contemporary settlers who were able to write did. 3 years after his arrival in the fledgling colony in 1609, he would write his version of the history of New France in a book called simply that, Histoire de la Nouvelle-France. It's shockingly original. I know, get used to these very generic names. It's par for the course at the time. While many of these types of books would appear through the years, it is significant for two reasons. On the one hand is the fact that it would have been one of the first examples of such a history of North America, and also that it did not shy away from lobbying criticism at the French administration and its plans. Lescarbot was quite complimentary of the Aboriginal populations he encountered, certainly a rarity at the time, and was even noted in considering them superior to the Europeans, particularly in Chapter 6 of his history. His writings also indicate, perhaps in contradiction to his respect of the natives, a promotion of long-term engagement by the French in North America, preferring settlement to the desire of instant riches and pilfering. He also misunderstands many of the traditions and customs of the natives and makes comparisons with Christianity that would be logical to him, and that would make for an easier justification for conversion on his part. But from the point of view of a commentator on the lives and history of the First Nations, it is surprisingly a passable early attempt. It's certainly less condescending than some that would come later on. But Lescarbot was also a poet and playwright that is worthy of note, and if not for the quality of his work or how well it aged, but for its place in North American history. There are two pieces that we can focus on in Lescarbot's oeuvre that can give us an idea of what the perception of New France was through artistic lenses. The first is an epic poem that would be written in New France, but published not too long before the aforementioned historical work, at a time when Lescarbot had returned to his country of origin. The poem is called La défaite des sauvages Armouchiquois, which translates to the defeat of the Armouchiquois savages. The name hasn't aged well, but as we've seen many times here, that was unfortunately the generic name given to the Native Americans, since First Nations was far from being adopted yet. The Armouchiquois nation that Lescarbot is actually referring to is what we would now know generally as the Abenaki people, the very same I talked about in episode 2. The subject, as would be expected from the title, is the recounting of a war between the Micmac nation, which he calls the Souriquois, and the Abenaki. It is actually one of the most violent and important wars between those two nations in recorded history. And the poem is one of the ways in which we know about it. There is inevitably some bias on Lescarbot's side, though, as the Abenaki were already French allies by the time the poem was written in 1607. Many decades later, the Micmac would join the confederacy that the Abenaki were a part of, but we're getting ahead of ourselves here. For now, the important thing to know is that this is the recounting of a military milestone in which Lescarbot is seeing allies of his people get destroyed. I'll read part of the poem here in its original French. I haven't found a translation of it, but for those who don't understand, the section sets up the conflict and explains it generally. Je chante Mambertou et l'heureuse victoire, qui lui acquit naguère une immortelle victoire, quand il joncha des morts les champs armouchiquois, pour la cause vengée du peuple souriquois. Entre ces peuples si une antique discorde, fait que bien rarement l'un à l'autre s'accorde. Et si parfois entre eux se traite quelque paix, cette paix se peut dire un attrape-niais. So while the poem is clunky and not particularly well written in my opinion, for those who understood it, there is some value in how it provides at least some perspective on the relations between different native nations. We can see an interpretation of how warfare was conducted, how warriors from different nations worked together and gathered in battle, as well as what the aftermath of this battle entailed for native populations. Wartime poems have a tendency in Canada to be more nationalistic and overly emotional, which can be interesting, but it gets kind of repetitive and a bit nostalgic. Personally, this is quite fun to look at because it is about a population that, when it was written about later, is often portrayed in a more romanticized way, and it shows a more grounded and realistic version of them. I'm sure many of my listeners have heard the term noble savage used in reference to the natives as this people who were portrayed as calm, in line with nature, and an all-around noble people, even in war. What we see here is a more brutal but distinctly realistic version of war. We learn of combat techniques and traditions, while also being able to examine how Lescarbot himself saw the indigenous nations, that is, as people capable of being good and bad, and to do what is necessary for the survival of their population. The backdrop of a war is an excellent way for Lescarbot to hit on many aspects of native ways, even if some of them don't come off as particularly flattering, especially in this day and age. I do want to move on to what is arguably Lescarbot's most famous work, at least the one that is most well known in Canadian history. He wrote in 1606 a very short play, the style of which is known as a masque, which essentially is a music-centric piece of theater that often involves dancing and visual spectacles over a consistent and drawn-out narrative. In a nice change of pace, the play did not have an uncomfortably racist name, and it was known as Le Théâtre de Neptune, which translates to the Theatre of Neptune. While it is certainly noteworthy for its being probably the first play to be written and presented in North America, I want to concentrate on the context surrounding its creation and its ever so slight influence. The survival aspect of the early days of the New France colonial project can barely be overstated, especially in the early 1600s. What is tantamount to a handful of men had to not only survive and set up viable living quarters through war with the native populations and the British, but fight off harsh winters and the sickness and hunger that came along with it. With this last idea in mind, in the winter of 1606 and 1607, Samuel de Champlain, then the governor of New France, established what he called l'ordre de bon temps, the order of good cheer. After a particularly harsh and brutal winter, the men established at Port Royal, including our main man Marc Lescarbot, were in dire need of, well, good cheer. The food had been scarce and scurvy had been rampant, but the whole point of this order was to help bring together the settlers and some native allies for a few days during the winter and have them hopefully forget their troubles for a while. The best food they could muster up was kept for the occasion, and music and dance were on the menu all night long. And by all accounts, this worked. Health and morale did indeed improve. Now, this didn't stop the Port Royal colony from eventually failing, but that was because of a series of factors that a few nights of partying couldn't help. Regardless, it was in this context that The Theatre of Neptune was written. In the play, volleys of cannons and muskets, trumpet fanfares, and the buffoonery of sailors and soldiers were all ingeniously but wildly combined with verse speeches to mark Lieutenant Governor Champlain's return from an expedition. The written text, which was actually only a mere 243 lines, which was very typical of the Masque style, features the god of the sea Neptune, 6 Tritons, 4 savages, and 1 cheery companion offering fulsome tribute to Poutrincourt, who was a client of Lescarbot and who is actually the one who invited the playwright to the colony. Native words and local objects are combined with classical poetic conventions. For example, a native expresses affection by presenting matachias to the sagamos and explaining that these signify Cupid's flames. By the way, a matachias is a French word for a wampum, which is a shell bead decoration that the natives had, and a sagamos is another word for a chief, specifically for the Algonquin tribes. Anyway, a Triton speaking Gascon dialect makes innuendos about old Neptune's love life. And of course, into all of this fun and jubilance is mixed this pompous and mock style that contains serious declarations of colonial ambitions of France. I have to be honest here, folks, there is a lot that happens in this very short play, and it is absolutely bonkers to try to explain it here in a summary. The length of the text does not reflect it, but the music and dancing would have made it much more of a spectacle than would initially be imagined just from the writing. And the goal, as I've said, was less to create a cohesive and impactful tale and more of a fun romp to cheer everyone up with jokes that would have been relevant to the audience. The Theatre of Neptune has been argued to belonging more validly to French than Canadian literature and traditions. The style of the play was one that would be more commonly recognized in the French theatrical world at the time, after all, and the people who set it up would not even have considered themselves to be Canadians. Yet it contains a serious attempt to reproduce a New World setting, with its 4 roles for Indigenous people and its scattering of words from native languages. But has it had a lasting impact? Well, yes and no. It was impactful for its recognition that it takes more than religion and men to make a colony and a life for yourself in this new world. Lescarbot was among those who understood what to do in order to add vitality and a distinctive nature to New France, to make it more than simply a place to explore and exploit. And his use of poetry and theater to not only tell a story, but to write down history is an example of this. But for the most part, that is pretty much where the impact dies. The style of writing used by Lescarbot would not become par for the course in Canadian letters and imagination, whether in French or in English. So he is noted more as a historical first than as someone who influenced the course of a nation's culture. Save for a few theater companies that took their name from his works and some occasional translations of his books, Lescarbot's name has barely made it through history outside of academic studies of New France. If we move on a bit to a few decades down New France's history, I want to spend some time on the relative lack of any real administrative oversight in the colony. I've said this many times now, but New France was massive, and the few inhabitants were located in towns and cities that were wildly spread out throughout that land. We tend to imagine Montreal, Quebec City, and so on today as these significant metropolises, but at the time, they were not only much smaller, but were mostly used for military or basic commercial purposes due to the immense proportion of soldiers that arrived and the need to defend the French possessions. Any other settlers were near these establishments, but were spread out in order to tend to agricultural fields. Add to this the slowness of movement and communication at the time, not only from France to its overseas colony, but from within the colony itself, and you get a place that is very difficult to govern as a totality. This means that most of the power in the colony, or at least the practical and administrative power, not the theoretical power, lied not in the hands of the lieutenant governor or some other higher up, but more on the ground level. The smaller authorities in sectors and towns, as well as the religious missionaries and priests who would preach to the natives and settlers, would have a much greater influence and power in the daily lives of the population of New France. In the case of the priests and the religious establishment, this would be especially important as New France became Lower Canada and became Quebec. The Catholic influence in this province was maintained for a very long time. And it's only in relatively recent years and decades that we've been trying to move away into a more secular age. Of course, the lieutenant governor had significant authority as well, whether it was in managing the lower-end positions of the hierarchy or in dealing with matters that concerned the colony as a whole. But for the most part, people were unconcerned or even unaware with what happened on such a grand scheme. Now, believe it or not, this short history lesson is important in how we approach our next text, the Récollet missionary Gabriel Sagard and his writings about New France. The Récollets, not unlike the Jesuit missionaries that we have talked about on this show before, were a branch of Catholicism, one that was closely related to the Franciscan order and that more strictly observed the rules of that order. Gabriel Sagard was probably one of the better-known members of the Récollets and arrived in New France in 1623, where he traveled to what was called Huronia, which is about in modern-day southern Ontario. His first book, The Long Journey to the Country of Hurons, described his voyage in very vivid detail filled with these grand descriptions, and features a sympathetic, if at times unflattering account of the life that the Hurons lived. Despite the criticism aimed at them, the book is one of the greatest accounts of their society and language produced at the time, and was an invaluable reference to later generations. In terms of literary history, the importance of this book is that it provides a kind of first-hand account of what would become the myth of the noble savage that I mentioned earlier. So, Sagard's analysis, while good and useful in some places, was unfortunately detrimental in others, in longer-term accounts. I mentioned Sagard's first book less because of its significance, but because it provides a basis for the next major book he wrote, Histoire du Canada, History of Canada. Most of the text, published in 1636, is about presenting the views of the natives by other Récollet missionaries, or seeks to expand and correct details that have changed or were incorrect from prior writings. It is a much more dry and direct book overall, with the recounting being less flowery and more matter-of-fact. One of the only things that is really maintained from one book to the next is the relation to nature that he emphasizes, not just for the Native Americans, but increasingly the French settlers who worked the land, toiled away, and who explored vast swaths of the territory. There was an association with the value of hard work and the right and true Catholic way in this history, and the writer plays it up not only for the Récollets, but for the settlers in general. This idea that participating in the construction and using your hard work in order to build something greater is very important for Sagard. And it's something that would stay within the mindset of Canadians and French Canadians as well. This idea of being the backbone of this great society and saying, well, we built a lot of these things off our own sweat and blood. What Sagard also does more of in his History of Canada is criticize the authority of New France and play up the aspect of the Récollets as a persecuted group. You see, just before the publication of this volume in the late 1620s, there was a brief moment when the British seized control of a nice chunk of French North American territory. During this time, many missionaries, notably the order that Sagard was a part of, were removed from the colony and shipped back home. The ones who did stay were left with a sense of alienation and lacked a sense of security even when the French regained control. There is a sense of embitterment at the loss of property and honor in New France when reading the Récollet writings on the matter. Any sense of pride that would have been felt prior to this even brief event would have been lost by the fact that, hey, it disappeared in an instant, and any power that you had was almost meaningless under this brief but powerful system. And it kind of foreshadows what would later come when the British system would become a bit more permanent. Gabriel Sagard didn't set out to initially write a scathing indictment of authority and a praise for the pastoral setting. It was simply a part that he believed was useful to his writing and that could be integrated quite easily into it. But I mention it here because it is a part of the continuity of New France and French-Canadian literature. The sense of alienation would inevitably grow and become more vocalized after a certain little event in 1763. And the use of the pastoral setting would become a romantic device for many French-Canadian writers down the line. As an example of how this evolved, let's take a look at our final writer for the episode. This is where we're going to make quite the jump to a post-New France period, to after the British took over. There are two reasons for this time jump. One, I try not to have the show go on for too long, and two, because outside of the types of writing that I just mentioned and the exploration ones, there isn't much to talk about in terms of French literary culture in Canada during that time. As I mentioned at the start, there is very little development at the time. But there is something that I want to mention before going to our final writer. I kind of buried the lead here, but the section on Marc Lescarbot is quite indicative of a necessity in New France. People still needed stories. Long winter nights and treks through unknown lands could be torture without some form of imagination to keep them company. There is evidence of books being brought from France into the colony by missionaries, lords, and soldiers. In fact, you can find some of those very texts in their original form in some rare books libraries and collections right here in Montreal. I've seen some of them. It's actually quite interesting and almost a disquieting experience. But these were inevitably minimal. Not as many could read and write back then. And if you could read, there would not be much room for you to bring more than a single book or maybe two. You certainly didn't bring an entire library with you. Even if you did know how to write, you wouldn't necessarily have easy access to paper and quill at all times. Let's be clear here. In that vein, one tradition that is often overlooked, though, is the folklore that sprung up in New France and that would be recounted as a kind of oral tale. These are tales of spirits in the night and deals with the devil, stories of great adventure and journeys from the old world to the new. They are an important part of the French-Canadian mindset, and one that needs to be covered in greater detail, but I've chosen to dedicate a whole episode to that in the future. The reason for it being that there will be a revival in the interest of those stories in the 19th century, when they will be written down in order to preserve the French-Canadian traditions that were perceived as being lost. I find it more interesting to examine them within that context and how they develop and change over time than to force them into an episode that is already filled enough as is. I just thought I should mention it in passing now at the very least, and come back to it later, just so that everyone is aware that this is something that I'm deliberately skipping over. Anyway, we're moving to the 1790s and 1800s to talk about Joseph Quesnel. This is about 40 years after the British conquest of New France, at a time when Canada was now officially known as Upper and Lower Canada. We're almost 150 years after Gabriel Sagard wrote his book featuring anti-authoritarian passages. But as we'll see, the sentiment will only have grown by the point we are reaching. When the British officially took over the French colony, it is important to know that while the institutions and higher official positions were obviously transitioned into a model based on their own, there was an understanding that the French-speaking Canadians should not be alienated by their new overlords. The goal was, of course, to eventually integrate them into the British-style society, but the French were allowed to keep their language, their religion, and their culture, as long as they pledged loyalty to the English crown. After all, they knew the territory, and they were numerous enough that if they really wanted to, they could cause trouble within the now British colony. This sounds good on paper, but in reality, let's face it, it's never that simple. There is inevitably going to be some bitterness towards having to adapt to a new system that took over by force and wants to change the way things had been done for hundreds of years at that point. Furthermore, just because the British and French lived on the same territory doesn't mean that any animosity dissipated. There was the eternal squabbles over religion. Protestant and Catholics haven't exactly meshed well for most of their respective histories. And there were some ingrained perceptions that kept coming up. The English were violent conquerors, and the French were a poor, ill-educated, and backwater people. It would be easy to think that these ideas and preconceived notions rapidly dissolved once the two populations just got along and Canada became a nice and sunny place of tolerance and openness since then. But that would be burying our heads in the sand. There were some distinctions within society, and as certain people maintained their places in certain places within that society, there were some perceptions that kept coming up over and over again. These lasted long enough that people, especially from older generations, still remember a time when such ideas were normal, at least in a certain form. And they formed the backdrop of many issues that would form between Franco and Anglo-Canadians for some time. But we'll get to those eventually. I wanted to give a context to the era in which Joseph Quesnel, a poet and playwright born in 1746, was writing. Quesnel was actually brought to Canada by force after having been seized by the British in 1779 as he was trying to bring supplies to America. Remember, this was smack in the middle of the War of Independence. So the British were trying their best to make sure the rebels had no help, especially from the French, who were already helping. He was allowed to settle in Lower Canada, where he got into the fur trade until 1793. In 1790, he would write and compose the first operetta to be performed in North America, called Colas and Colinette. Aside from the pastoral setting, and the fact that it is another French first on the continent, the opera's relation to our story here is minimal. Every once in a while, it's performed here in Quebec, so I guess that's pretty cool, and it shows a desire to remember important French moments from the province's past, which should come as no surprise. But in and of itself, for our purposes here, it's just to provide context. Around this time, and over the next few years, Quesnel would write other plays and poems, including Les Républicains Français and L'Anglomanie. Respectively, these can be translated to The French Republicans and Anglomania. Interestingly, both are quite different satires that represent two different aspects of Canadian life and politics as it would develop down the road. Les Républicains Français is a savage take on the excesses of the French Revolution. It's only one act, and Quesnel uses that time to really hammer home his point. He does this by having 5 members of the New Order talk about the good that their new government is doing. As the night goes on and they get increasingly drunk, the truth about republicanism is revealed as being morally and politically bankrupt. This attack on the Republican political system is a recurring theme in Canadian politics, especially from the Tory or Conservative platform, although that has kind of gone away progressively with time, but especially at the beginning that was very much true. Most of those Tory politicians would have been critical of it from an American perspective, but it was a criticism on republicanism nonetheless, with them favoring the constitutional monarchy that we have here as a less chaotic and radical form of government. It is rather ironic that Quesnel would share these views with later British-inspired politicians, when considering the subject matter of the other satirical work I mentioned, L'Anglomanie. This is where we're going to return to our point about the criticism of authority in French-Canadian literature, as this 1803 verse text is all about resisting what Quesnel refers to as Anglomania, which is, of course, Beatlemania, but for the English in general. I'm just kidding, of course, but the whole plot revolved around laughing at the Anglophone bourgeoisie and how they get their way in the world by ostensibly converting everyone to their ways and convincing them that the British way of life is the superior way of life. It depicts a French-Canadian lord, or seigneur, who is persuaded to imitate English ways by his son-in-law, who is the aide of the British governor. The point is obviously to encourage French Canadians to be their own people, capable of their own culture within the Canadian context, outside of the British, and that you don't need those pesky English people telling you how to act. Much like Sagard and the Récollet missionaries who were expulsed in the 17th century, there is an element of preservation of the memory of a time when the French were dominant in the land, or that they were at least capable of doing things independently from the British. The difference is, of course, that the British control of North America would not be temporary, as it had been in Sagard's time. A text like L'Anglomanie would have been quite topical and relevant at the time, as the French Canadians were increasingly coming to terms that veritable positions of power were not and would almost never be held by people other than those of British descent, or at least in their own time. These issues would actually escalate into armed conflicts, both in Upper and Lower Canada, although for slightly different reasons in both provinces, in the 1830s, when better representation in the government was demanded of the quote-unquote common folk, which in Lower Canada were the francophones. Unfortunately for Quesnel, these last two works would never see the light of day in the public sphere within his lifetime, despite their relevance and ability to make quite a scathing social commentary on both local and international issues. Especially in a 19th century Catholic province, it was difficult to get the Church to sign off on seeing such anti-authoritarian work published. As I've mentioned earlier, the Catholic Church would have been one to be more on board with the status quo than anything else, advocating a lack of action from its people so as to not rock the boat too much. We can get into the reasons behind that later. There might be some deconstruction to do on that, but that's enough to talk about for now. L'Anglomanie would actually only be published in 1932 in one of the oldest French newspapers in North America, called Le Canada Français, which, fun fact, is still in operation today, although it mostly just covers its local area of Saint-Jean. But just because it missed its mark in the early days of British North America, it doesn't mean that Quesnel didn't have an impact on the Canadian imagination. He hits on issues that remain pertinent even in the 1930s and onward, and he tapped into a feeling of alienation that many would have felt to be true in Lower Canada. Obviously, not everyone agreed with that feeling of alienation, and I've been giving this perspective that all French Canadians and French people have felt this shame of being conquered by the British. But it is nevertheless something that we need to mention, and a source of issues that has dogged the nation of Canada for a long time. I want to conclude this episode with a quote from C.R.P. May that I've taken from the Oxford Companion to Canadian Literature that I feel captures the essence of what I was going for in this overview. Quote, "Canadian poetry in French has been, for half a century, a screen to mask the community's sense of deprivation. More often than one would imagine, poets have used the Amerindian as the analogy of precarious survival. The myth of the land sublimates a harsh and tedious existence. Catholic piety, occasionally vibrantly alive, sublimates the rest of life." End quote. While the direct comparisons to the plight of the Native Americans would appear a bit later, outside the purview of this episode, the rest of this quote is pretty spot on. The sense of striving for a better life and resentment towards the felt oppression by the English is a recurring motif in the French Canadian writing that sees itself taking root way back in the 17th century and remains to this day in some form or another, especially in periods of nationalist upheaval in Quebec. The catalysts behind these sentiments and the way they are expressed change over time, but the inciting element remains relatively consistent. That is, ultimately the value of this new France literature, as a way to create a pretty interesting continuity between the past and now, and can ask us to think about where certain issues that we believe to be contemporary are actually rooted in much deeper history than we might have been aware of. Okay, that should be just about it for this episode. Thanks everyone for listening. You can support this show through the Ko-fi page I set up, the link for which is in the description below. Although in these times it's very understandable that such a request is unfeasible, so feel no pressure. This show will still be here if you don't. It's free and independent, so feel no obligation for do that whatsoever. If you have any questions, comments, or concerns, you can always email them to me at historiacanadiana@gmail.com. I'm also on Twitter at CanLitHistory if you want to reach out to me through there to suggest topics or just discuss. Finally, if you would consider leaving a review, even if there are no comments, it would be very appreciated. It really does help. For now, I'll just say that I wish you all excellent health, and that I hope you and your loved ones can stay safe in these intense times. I'll see you next time on Historia Canadiana. Cheers, everyone.